Hello there and welcome back to another video. In today's video, I'm gonna finally be installing my Dell R720 server into my rack along with some other equipment to build a sandbox environment for working with virtual machines, VLANs, iDRAC, and several other things that I want to learn about. I want this environment to consist of this old X-Enterprise gear that will hopefully be hooked up in a very versatile manner in order to allow me to set it up in any way, shape, or form to learn about these things. Obviously, the star of the show today is going to be this Dell R720 server. The reason that I'm choosing to use this server is because I already own it and have for a while. In the meantime, between the other two videos that I've done with this machine, it sat under a bed literally collecting dust. So even though it's not the best server you can get for these purposes, nor the most efficient or powerful, I already have it on hand and will be putting it to use finally. Alongside the Dell R720, I'll also be installing my Juniper Networks EX3300 network switch that I've also had for a while. I plan to deploy this switch with some quiet Noctua fans earlier this year, but it overheated with them, and since then, I've just held onto it and might as well make use of it now. And an important reason as to why I'm able to make use of this switch now, even though it's got its really loud stock fans in it, is because this section of my Homelab is not going to be running 24/7. No. Instead, I plan to make this part of the Homelab easy to turn on and off so that I can turn it on when I want to run an experiment or learn something, and then turn it off once I'm done. So the noisy fans aren't a massive issue due to them not being on all the time. Obviously, I'm going to need to be able to connect everything here, and I'm going to be making a lot of connections this time around for maximum versatility, so let's run through what I picked up for making all these network links. I bought a whole bunch of OM3 fiber optic cables, which I'm going to use to hook everything up with 10 gigabit per second fiber optic links, because fiber is cool and 10 gigabit is really nice. I also picked up some LC keystone jacks that I'll put in my patch panel because I really want to keep the front of my rack looking clean. Then, I grabbed another one of the same dual-port 10 gigabit per second SFP Plus cards that I use in my NAS and desktop computers so that I can connect the server to the switch with two 10 gigabit per second links. Alongside all that, I also picked up some more utilitarian hardware that will make this setup work better for me, and that will also allow me to make some more connections, but I'll get to all of that stuff once I'm actually installing things in the rack. However, before I pull my rack out of the closet and start hooking things up, I need to finish configuring the R720 server with all of the correct hardware. Currently, I have two Intel Xeon E5 2695V2 CPUs installed in the server, which I'm not going to be changing as there's some of the more powerful chips available for this machine, and so upgrading would be decently pointless. I also have 64 gigabytes of DDR3 ECC RAM installed, and that might end up getting upgraded sometime in the future, but for now, I'm perfectly fine with having only 64 gigs of RAM. However, the one thing that this server is not configured with at all is storage, so let's run through what I bought to sort out storage on this server. For bulk storage on this server, I wanted to have several drives that I could configure in different RAID types, and also that I could use to keep most of this server's data stored locally, rather than on something like my NAS, as I really want this environment to be fully breakable while not affecting my actual network if, or when, I absolutely wreck something. So I purchased 6 of these HGST brand 1.2 terabyte 10K RPM SAS drives. These were super cheap, at about $22 a drive, and they've probably been used incredibly heavily throughout their lives. But for the purposes of this lab, they're going to work perfectly. I'm not going to be storing any data that I care about on them either, so if something happens to one or more of them and my RAID redundancy fails me, it shouldn't be a big deal. Then, as an OS drive, I wanted some kind of an SSD, and so I ended up choosing this 200 gigabyte HGST SAS SSD. In previous videos, some people pointed me in the direction of Samsung's SATA SSDs, saying that they work pretty well in these servers, but I chose to go this route because I figured it might be a little more interesting than just throwing a regular desktop drive in there. Sure, it was kind of expensive for its size, but this is my fun lab and I wanted to have an enterprise SAS SSD because I can. So really, the only hardware that I'm going to be installing in this server today is going to be those drives as well as the 10 gigabit card. But I will do just a few other things while I'm inside the server as well. So let's open it up and begin installing the hardware. The first thing I did was install the 10 gigabit per second PCI Express card, which was easy enough as it's just a PCIe card. Then I installed all of the drives into the front SAS bays of the server, putting the SSD into bay 0 and the 6 hard drives in bays 2 through 7. I left bay 1 empty because I might pick up a second SSD at some point and put them in RAID 1. But for now, I didn't want to spend another $40 on a second SSD. Finally, I put some extra DIMM slot dust covers that I had on hand into some of the uncovered DIMM slots just for the sake of completeness. I then booted up the server to ensure that all of the hardware was recognized in some fashion, and I also quickly set up the drives with the inbuilt PERC 710 RAID controller. I set up the SSD as a RAID 0 with just a single drive in order to pass it through to the OS, and I set up the 6 1.2TB hard drives as another RAID 0 just because I'm curious about what kinds of speeds they'll be capable of pulling off. I'll likely switch to either a RAID 5 or a RAID 6 after I run this little experiment, but with all of that done, the server is ready to be put into the rack. This is my rack. It's really dusty and it lives in my closet, and I am not going to clean it today because I cannot be bothered to. Also, I should welcome you to my dingy floor, where most of the rest of this video will be spent, as I'm not going to be putting the rack on my desk for hopefully obvious reasons. Anyway, the plan is to lay the server across these bottom beams of the rack because I don't want to spend the $50 on a set of R720 rails, and this will work probably good enough. Then, I'll mount the Juniper EX3300 in the U right above the R720, meaning that I will need to move this rack shelf here up by 1 U. So, I went ahead and moved the rack shelf up by 1 U, which was a bit of a chore, but I got it done. And next, I slid the server in across the bottom beams of the rack, where it sits relatively well with just a little bit of the server hanging out the back. Then, I threw the switch in on top of the server, after plugging in an Ethernet cable to its management port and a power cord to its power port though, as accessing those might have been a bit annoying to do after racking it. Everything had been going perfectly up until this point, but then, when putting my 2 desktop computer servers back on the rack shelf, disaster struck. The fit was about 5mm too tight, and even after removing the rubber feet from the computers, they still wouldn't fit. Thankfully, I was able to come up with a solution. Due to the construction of this rack shelf, I should be able to flip it upside down and gain an extra inch or so of space to place the 2 desktop computers on. Thankfully, I was able to get the computers, which run things like a VPN server and a Minecraft server, back in the rack. And just like that, it's finally time to begin the great hookupping of cables. I started by removing 3 of my RJ45 Keystone pass-through jacks from my patch panel and replacing them with the 3 LC Keystone jacks that I bought with my fiber optic cables. After adding some labels to the space above the fiber Keystone jacks, and a label for the RJ45 jack on the end that I'll be plugging the 3300's management port into, I moved around to the back of the rack to sort out power. I bought a second one of these rack mount power strips for this project that I'm going to install here, not because I need more outlets, but because I want a nice switch that allows me to fully cut power to the Juniper and the 720. Otherwise, the Juniper's fans stay on all the time, even if the switch is halted, and the 720 also makes some noise even when off. All this power strip is really doing is allowing me to easily switch off this whole section of the lab, and so I mounted it right below the main strip and just cascaded its power connection off of that one. Then, I grabbed the 3 power cables from the switch and the server and made them into a nice snake that I could hopefully manage somewhat well. Since this is the back of my rack though, I don't care as much as I probably should about cable management, and so it's still not going to be great. After that, I plugged in all 3 cables and then tied them off into a nice loop that should stay somewhat out of the way. The next connections that I made to the server were several of the network connections. This server has a bunch of network interfaces available to it, and my switch is also a massive 48-port switch. Plus, I want maximum versatility, so why not just plug all of them in? This is probably a bit of a stupid thing to do, and it likely will never be something that's fully utilized, but I could also genuinely see having several different connections from the server to the switch being useful, so that's what I ended up doing. I plugged 8 Ethernet cables into the 8 gigabit Ethernet ports on the server, and ran them to the front of the rack in the form of this absolute behemoth of a cable bundle. After that was done, I ran one more Ethernet cable from the iDRAC interface on the server to the front of the rack, where I then plugged it into one of the ports on the EX3300. Finally, it was time for the fiber optic links, of which I was going to be connecting 2 from this server to the switch. I plugged some cables along with some SFP+ transceivers into the back of the server and ran them up to the back of the Keystone jacks that I had installed earlier. From there, I took those 2 Keystone jacks and connected them to 2 of the Juniper's 4 10 gigabit per second uplink ports. I then made one last connection from the 3rd LC Keystone jack to the 3rd 10 gig port on the Juniper, and that pretty much wraps up the fiber optic connections that I'll be making in this video. This 3rd uplink port on the EX3300 will be connected to the spare 10 gigabit per second port that's on my desktop computer from the network card that I installed in my NAS networking upgrade video. The only connection left to make for this setup was to take a cable from one of the EX2200's ports and run it to one of the EX3300's ports. The EX2200 is the switch near the top of the rack, and that switch is on the main LAN and has internet access. So this link should enable the network I'm building on the EX3300 to have internet access, which is important for certain things. However, I plan to have this connection VLAN off so that things that don't need to have internet connection won't have internet connection. Finally, after putting the now much heavier rack back into the closet and reconnecting all of the Ethernet, fiber, and power cables that are usually coming out of it, it was time to boot everything up for the first time. Here we go, I'm going to flick the switch that should power on the regular rack gear, and then of course I'll boot up the special stuff. Alright, now I'm going to hit the switch and this should boot the 720 and the 3300. And it will probably produce quite a lot of noise. I gotta hit the power button on the 720. There we go. Thankfully, everything booted up exactly how I expected it to, and I know for a fact that some of you are probably really curious about the configuration that I'm running on this little network. However, I'm choosing not to be including any of that here this time, just because I'm learning this stuff right now for myself, and therefore don't feel comfortable talking about it in a video yet. However, I can tell you, as script writing me, who has played with this setup for several hours at this point, that I got iDRAC fully functional after filling a pool with blood, sweat, and mostly tears. And I also was able to set up some VLANs to manage what interfaces are connected to the internet, as well as a DHCP server on the EX3300 to provide IPs for the 172.16.0.x LAN that is the main local LAN on this isolated network. I'm really excited to play more with this setup, and I hope that you were able to at least enjoy me building it, and maybe even learn a thing or two in the process. I also hope to see you next time. Goodbye.